Your journey has been an interesting one up to here. You've questioned so much more than those around you. You've even questioned yourself as to how you could have grown into these thoughts. Am I crazy? When did I begin to think differently? Why do people in general appear so limited in their thought process? Rest assured, you are not alone. The world is slowly waking up to what you already know inside, yet can't quite verbalize. Welcome to the Spiritual Dope Podcast. The show that answers the questions you never even knew to ask, but needed the answers to. Questions about you, this world, the people in it. Most importantly, how do I proceed now moving forward? We don't claim to have all the answers, but we sure do love living in the question. Time for another hit of Spiritual Dope with your host, Brandon Henley. Let's get right into today's episode.
Hey there, Spiritual Dope. I am on here today with Greg Wieting. He is a healer who helps leaders and entrepreneurs heal the anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and trauma they can't think or talk their way out of. He is the founder of Prisma, a framework overlaying trauma, neuroscience, and energy medicine with somatic and mindfulness-based principles. He developed this while healing his own anxiety, depression, and chronic pain rooted in trauma. This included unraveling a severe spinal curvature and standing 3 inches taller today. Over the last 2 decades, Greg has helped thousands heal through his one-on-one practice and has certified hundreds of healthcare professionals in his methodology. His new online course and community now make healing practical and accessible to all. Greg, thanks for being on today.
Hey, Brandon. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So, Greg and I were talking a little bit. He's out in San Francisco. For those that have tuned into the podcast, that's where I was born, right? So it's always fun to talk to people in San Francisco. Greg, when you drove into San Francisco, like how cool is like that scene? Like when you see like all the houses up on the hills, they're all like different colors. And it's just like an interesting, really, how fun was that?
Yeah, my first trip to San Francisco was probably back in 99, 2000. I was living in Seattle at the time. And yeah, just magical coming over the Golden Gate Bridge. And sometimes before you even get into the city, coming over the bridge, the way the city's lit up at the late afternoon, it almost looks all white, kind of like flushed in the late day sun. And it just looks like cool. This like glowing city. And then, yeah, once you get into the neighborhoods, you see all the vibrant colors and yeah, just lots of character, lots of charm.
So much fun. Well, Greg, I usually like to start this off with the whole idea that you and I are simply conduits for universal life energy, and it's expressing itself through us, hopefully in this podcast for somebody's greatest and highest good. And it can only be expressed right now on this podcast in this moment. What's coming through you today that you feel like you should be sharing?
Yeah, well, I think, I reached out because that's the essence of how I work with my clients. And that's the essence, the foundation of just my own healing practice, really getting out of our way, right? Letting go of fixed attachment to outcome, letting go of rigid agendas that are coming from kind of the limitations of the mind, opening up to something more universal. I think that's where, as much as I try to demystify healing and make it really practical and grounded, when we open up to that universal connection, that's where the magic happens.
That's really cool. I love the idea, right, of, these rigid agendas, right, kind of letting go and letting it happen. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that's the first time I've heard it pronounced that way. But as I kind of walk through and try, and I struggle sometimes talking with people, like, you got to let go of like the linearity and just kind of let it happen. And they're like, what do you mean by that? I'm like, I don't know, but that's how it works. Right. So like, the way you pronounce it, the way you announce it though, rigid agendas, like what's a rigid agenda and how can we let go of that?
Yeah. And it's a tricky, nuanced thing because I think we probably come to healing because we want something. Right? We probably come to healing because we have some pain point that we want to resolve, or we have some question that we want answered. And so there is this idea that perhaps there's something that needs to be fixed or resolved. So I want to honor that we, sometimes that tendency to have a fixed, rigid agenda is actually what gets us to a healing path in the first place. And it's also going to be what gets in the way. I guess I can just share, in terms of, the curve in my spine. I don't actually practice yoga as much as I used to. I kind of do other things physically right now, but when I used to get on my yoga mat and I felt like, oh, I just want to get in like a deep back bend because, I'm just really feeling the tension around the curve in my spine. So if I had this fixed agenda to actually get into a deeper back bend, to open my spine, to unravel my, that curve, it was like me coming at my body from kind of a violent place because I actually wasn't accepting my body where it was. So, the core of how I work and, what I try to impart to those I work with is just a deep acceptance of what is. And in that deep acceptance of what is when things can actually start to change, but not necessarily according to the plan that we have made up in our minds. Because healing is pretty nonlinear. It's not a direct shot.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love that idea too, right? Coming at yourself like almost in a violent way. And it's like, you will obey everything I throw at you. And the body's like, well, maybe not today. Yeah. Right. And not in the way that you think that it's going to. And as we talk about, like, I guess linearity and in healing, right? So, Greg, if I come to you and I'm in pain and something's going on and like you don't heal me in that like moment, then how do, like, what is the linearity aspect of it? Because that's how, like, we see things on a timeline, most of us, right? Yeah. And we don't see this kind of everything that goes this holistic kind of 360 view. So what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, for me, before I actually would bring anyone on to work with, I'd have a conversation to manage expectations and to let folks know that that's just not how I work. Although many of my clients and students are going to see some shifts that are pretty tangible, from the get-go, pretty upfront. That's not how it works for everyone, right? Right. And, actually, I kind of look at my work as actually helping people be with their pain, because how much of our life have we been running from our pain? Have we been suppressing our pain? And so we may suppress the emotional pain that comes out as physical pain, right? Right. So for me, I'm managing expectations and,
So what's that look like if I come into you for an appointment, right? What's that call gonna, or even that appointment gonna look like?
Yeah, well, the first call is letting folks know. I mean, for me, right now, when I'm working with clients, it's a 9 or 12 month arc of transformation. Not to say it takes 9 or 12 months to get out of pain, but to do the deeper work that I'm committed helping my clients get at. We're looking at kind of resolving, the wounding of, early attachment wounds and, trauma patterns that have kind of calcified in the body, right? The subconscious, unconscious mind take up residence in the body. And it takes time to kind of understand how that has imprinted upon us in our beliefs and our behaviors. And so kind of reverse engineering that is a process. So that initial conversation is, saying, hey, this is going to be a process. Right. And we may not, surface any major breakthroughs, in the first few sessions. It may take time. Sure. I pride myself on kind of a trauma-informed approach, which is, slow and steady, and safe and sustainable. Because I look at a lot of, I think in this world, I've heard the word like healing crisis. And I kind of look at that more as healthcare mismanagement, where people are trying to force things to move and shift and heal too fast, too soon. But
yeah, Greg, I mean, we're not ones that like to wait around, right? Like we want it like our Netflix, right? We want it like our gigabit download speeds, right? So yeah, I love that. God, what healing, healthcare mismanagement? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, I used to hear the word healing crisis tossed around a bunch, and it's like, well, what's happened is that we've overtaxed the system in trying to heal it and trying to change it, which has then, created this crisis, which I think I've seen people use that word healing crisis as if it's a good thing. And it's like, no, that's healthcare mismanagement. That's lacking a trauma-informed lens where you're trying to move the system through a process that it's not ready to move through. So, I think when it comes to healing trauma is usually the effect of something that was too much, too soon, too fast, that overwhelmed the system. So we didn't have the capacity or the resources to be with it and metabolize it. So healing is slowing all of that down.
Right. So been studying a lot of breath work recently this past year, and one of the things they talk about is I guess in the animal kingdom, that animals they you watch them, they go through something, they shake it off, right? They get rid of that there's like an energetic release of whatever it was that they just went through, and humans don't necessarily do that, right? So as you were talking about, right, like this trauma, it gets stuck in us, and I love that you're saying, the calcified aspect of it gets stuck in us, and we don't release it, we don't address it, and it kind of builds up, right? Is that kind of how you're seeing it too? Real similar to that? Is that along the right lines?
Absolutely.
Of how trauma kind of gets trapped inside of us? And just as we're talking about that, right? Is there what can we do to address trauma like sooner? Right? How can we recognize that we just had a traumatic moment, and what can we do in those moments to heal so that it's not calcifying?
And I love that. I use that imagery too. I saw, on one of the nature shows, a gazelle being chased by a cheetah. And the moment the gazelle realized it was no longer in danger, it just does this ritual shaking, and then instantaneously goes back to just eating grass and just, without a care. Right. And we don't do that. So learning how to do that, but really just normalizing it. Because what if a lot of our trauma response, our stress response, which then turns into the anxiety and the depression, what if it's actually a healthy response to a pretty unhealthy world, right? I want to remove the stigma out of mental health. I don't even like the word mental illness, because mental illness is often treated as a condition without actually recognizing the trauma beneath it. So if you just support and heal the trauma, then these conditions tend to kind of fade away. Or the trouble with a mental illness diagnosis is then creating an identity around the illness. And we're not our illness, just like we're not our trauma. And so I think removing the stigma and normalizing it, and I think conversations like this helping us realize that, wait, what if we can slow down to kind of feel the impact that life has had on us? We're just rushing over experience. That's all we're doing, is rushing from one experience to another. So how do we just build that in? Just a lot of my friends are creatives, and just like, how do we just even build in a day of space for nothing? Right. Just creating space for nothing, so then we can kind of tap back into that creative impulse or that universal impulse. So I think, making that a practice, carving out time. I think self-care, I think there's some idea of self-care, like going to the movies, getting a pedicure, or self-care is like self-inquiry, right? Self-care as, doing this deeper emotional attunement to our unmet needs, right? And mapping that and acknowledging.
What's an exercise like that, Greg? That sounds great. Like, I mean, how can I do that? Like, what's that look like?
I wish I could reverse engineer it to have 3 bullet points, right? And I'm trying to come up with those 3 bullet points now. I have a whole module in my course around mapping unmet needs, right? Because so often we normalize our unmet needs, and then when we feel the impact of having unmet needs, we then think that something's wrong with us, right? And so then we start to feel pathological in these unmet needs. And then we believe that we're not even worthy of having needs, much less being supported or asking for what we want. So, really, I talk about grieving the loss of what never was. So in early development, if we didn't have, reliable, consistent care and support, trauma isn't just like, violence and abuse. It's also neglect, right? And so that comes at a cost. And when that's, especially in early development, we normalize that, and then we assume that we're not getting what we need because something's wrong with us. So it's kind of recognizing that maybe nothing's wrong with me. I didn't get what I needed. That had an impact on me, understanding what that impact is, and then working through that emotional impact, processing that, which then makes us more available to, take care of our own needs, but then also get our needs met relationally.
Right. And if and Greg, let's talk a little bit about how you found yourself in this space. If I understand correctly, like you found your way into this space through like Reiki and energy work, right? And that kind of opened up the healing space for you. Is that right? Am I tracking there?
Yeah, with the curve in my spine, I used to live in severe chronic pain, anxiety, depression. And I had a friend who was a massage therapist. She offered me a massage. Physical touch at the time was painful. I turned down a massage from a friend. And she said, well, what about Reiki, which I'd never heard of, but I had great trust in her. And she said, I don't even have to touch, or it can be very light touch. And I realized I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for. I could just feel, and I didn't even know what the nervous system was at that time. Sure. Feel my whole body just take an exhale and just soften.
So you responded very well to the Reiki.
Yeah. So that was the first session, and we were living 2.5 hours apart. This was when I was living in Montana at the time, but I would head down to Missoula pretty often. So, have some sessions, but within a year I'd moved to Seattle, and that's when I started to study Reiki and, really commit to the practice. And then that kind of led me to the mindfulness and the meditation, and just kind of building that led to kind of trauma and neuroscience, and kind of connecting all these pieces that, I felt were the pieces that helped me heal without having to think or talk my way through it. Because again, just tapping into a deeper current of my body's wisdom and letting that organizational intelligence, that consciousness repattern, we can do that through kind of an expanded field of awareness, not with the limitation of, the mind.
Right. I'm a fan of Hawkins, Dr. Hawkins, was it David Hawkins, right? Who talks about that, right? I guess, kind of getting responses from your body as like a yes, no, right? Kind of questions, be like, hey, what's, your body's going to respond to certain things. And it will be right. And that's really kind of your subconscious guiding you through tapping into a field that you just normally don't feel like you're tapped into, but you're tapped into it at all times. Is that right? Is that kind of?
Yeah. If we get a paper cut, there is a healing mechanism that sends platelets and proteins and orchestrates all these biochemical transmissions, right? We're not thinking we're not thinking our way through that. There's, a deep wisdom. In chiropractic, they call that innate wisdom, right? I practice energy medicine called Body Talk, which was developed by an osteopath and chiropractor. And so we're consulting with the body's innate wisdom to guide us to kind of, what is the priority to restore internal communication. So because of trauma or stress, where is the nervous system short-circuited? Where have these breakdowns in communication, occurred that need to be restored? And so we can actually consult the body's innate wisdom to repair these pathways of communication. I love the imagery of the body being a symphony orchestra. And so if every tissue and cell and bone and memory and belief and hormone and neurotransmitter are all just players in that symphony orchestra, when we're expressing health, there's this musicality of being, we're in this harmonic resonance.
Sure.
But over time, stress, trauma, overwhelm, environmental toxins in our food, intergenerational patterns just start to accumulate, short circuit that communication. So then, we're starting to make more noise than music. And so then that's when the symptoms start to creep up. And so that's the other piece. We can start to look at our symptoms as the body's cry for help. And if we start to pay attention to the systems before they're screaming, but they're just like gentle whispers, we can usually stay on top of them before it becomes, too much.
Right, right. No, I love that. I mean, what's an example that you would say, somebody, like, when you're talking about the symphony, and I always think about, like, maybe actually my kids just did a band rehearsal, was watching a band rehearsal, and my youngest one, like, he hit the cymbal too soon, right? And you could tell, like, it was just off, right? So when as the body's going, right, how can you tell, like, somebody's hit your cymbal, you're hitting the cymbal too soon, something is off, not aligned, that you should pay attention to?
I might not answer. So how, because how I work is non-diagnostic and non-prescriptive. So I'm not necessarily determining what's off so much as my work is to actually see the doorway of possibility. So I think that's a big shift in healing too. I think in healing, we're so organized around the pain or the problem. And so I train my mind to focus on the possibility. So I'm not actually that concerned with what's out of tune. I'm just looking for what's the input of energy that can then support just the recovery and the new expression of harmony to come online.
Is that kind of how you work through your curvature?
Yeah. So the first, and that curve unraveled, over many years. But I'd say the first time I felt a significant shift, probably of almost an inch within one healing session, I was receiving body talk and Reiki, which is all energy medicine. And, the practitioner was balancing some hormones, just some beliefs from early childhood to, I don't even remember what else, but, an example in body talk is we may balance a certain memory to a certain belief tied into a certain muscle, tied into a certain hormone. And it's like, once we've identified these different vibrations that want to come into a new harmonic resonance, that's going to have ripple effects on the entire energy matrix of the whole body, right? Because if my entire body is a consciousness and we start to create new harmonic resonance within different parts, then the whole system is going to kind of refresh and update to a new harmonic understanding of itself. And so instead of treating the curve in my spine, we harmonized emotions, beliefs, and memories. And then the curve in my spine got to have a new understanding of itself. And I look at the connective tissue and the fascia as what really holds the muscles and the bones together. And the connective tissue and fascia is also where we store memories and traumas and beliefs. So like, as we help the system start to metabolize that, and then the identities, right? Because if we're carrying a trauma around and then we're carrying this victim consciousness in our body, it's gonna, that's gonna affect our posture, right? If you see, and you can just see different people walking down the street, that some people maybe are carrying like a very relaxed and empowered posture. Others, are kind of, guarded and hunched over and protection or fear, so it's like the body, we're carrying these costumes and masks that we can start to repattern through, all of these tools, mindfulness, just helping to, reorient. So it's like, oh, I'm actually not the victim that my trauma might otherwise believe me to be, right? So, well, then who am I if I'm not that? And I think healing affords us the space to kind of explore that and then live into that.
Right. So rather than coming in and telling me that I've got some serious issues, right, you're like, all right, Brandon, we're going to work through, you are however you are right now, right? How would you kind of like to be? Or is, here's a vision or a possibility for you in your life. Would you like to work towards that? Right? Is that kind of how it works out? And then you do your modalities, right? But I got to assume that I've got to be open to it for it to work.
Sure. I mean, yes and no. Yeah. So my initial call with clients, I want to get to have an understanding of what their goals are, what the vision they hold for their future. And I want to hold that vision. And I think mapping our desire is very powerful. I think there's a lot of fuel from desire that I think trauma can actually suffocate or mute. So we want to, name that. And then I want to hold the vision of helping, the body's innate wisdom live in the fulfillment of that. And yet each session I say, well, all right, I see what your vision is, but now let's just see where your body is, and let's meet your body, mind, and spirit where they are. And then let's see what new possibility wants to emerge from where you are now. So we're not forcing you to this destination. We're just supporting your system to kind of find the most harmonic resonance that's optimal for it in this moment to lead it on that trajectory. And yes and no in terms of having to have a belief in the work. I mean, yeah, most people need to be open to some sort of alternative to explore my type of work. And a lot of folks find me when they're at the end of their rope. I had a client who came and they were $100,000 in medical debt and couldn't get out of bed for 2 years. So they're finally willing to give something else a try. So I kind of work with a lot of mystery illness as well, because it's like, and I have a team of naturopaths and a psychiatrist that refer patients to me where it's like, oh, we've done the treatments, we've done the medications, nothing's working, because actually the trauma is, stagnating the system. So it's not responding to these treatments. So let Greg come in and work with the trauma. But I've had a few skeptics over the years. I had a client when I lived back in Montana, and he said, I think what you do is bullshit, but my wife has just been asking me to come for for months or years, however long it was. So here I am finally. And then he became, a really close, committed client because, and I joke when I'm teaching this work that, don't believe in anything I share or teach. It's like, have your own experience, right? So I don't believe in energy medicine. I have an experience of energy medicine. Right?
Sure.
And
Yep.
That's enough.
Yeah. Sure. There's a knowing, right? A different sense in that 100%. And I love that. Well, let's, talk a little bit about, what you have created, Prisma. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, my path was not a direct path. It wasn't linear. It wasn't easy. I found that a lot of traditional approaches to therapy, which I'm not knocking therapy. Therapy has been a huge piece of my journey, which has been great. But I have found a lot of approaches to therapy were ill-equipped to address the impacts of trauma that were stored in my body physically, right? So as much as therapy helped me develop a really good intellectual framework and shift a lot of my intellectual framework around my wounding, it kind of wasn't able to uncover and resolve what was happening, physically in terms of the chronic pain, and still then the residue that was still creating the anxiety and depression in my body. So, that left me on this search. And so, Prisma is kind of a fusion of all the tools that I found to be most relevant on my path. And so the course itself is an 8-week course that I consider like a roadmap for healing. And then the 7 Prisma pillars, which I found are kind of like the essential drop pins on that map. So, because I think we can go to healers or therapists for years, but kind of still feel blindfolded, like we don't really know where we're going. And not that we're all going to the same place, but I think there are some universal themes in the path of healing. And so I think those drop pins really guide people through kind of an arc of transforming pain into purpose. Because I think that deriving a sense of place and purpose is really imperative to just having a deeper sense of self in this world, especially as the world becomes increasingly, uncertain. How can we be certain of our place in an uncertain world? And I think that is really valuable. So that's like the trauma and neuroscience in that map. And then I offer somatic and mindfulness-based practices, which are kind of embedded in the map, but then I offer guided meditations to help us put it to practice. So that's the mind training that, again, is helping us shift our identity from pain to the truth of who we are, and shifting from pain to possibility. And then the energy medicine component is a self-care foundation training. So that's like, you have the map, the drop pins, the meditations are kind of the GPS, and then I look at the energy medicine as the vehicle. So then you have the right type of vehicle that you need for a lifetime of healing. So the culmination of all the tools I've kind of, accumulated over the years, and how I've kind of pieced them all together in a meaningful way that now I can kind of impart that to others.
That's awesome. So, I mean, throughout your journey, you've found these things that have worked for you and with your clients, and you've, as a kind of a holistic practice and manner, put this together in a way that's, practical and applicable for. Would you say this is open to like a layperson, or does somebody need to have some experience before they tap into this course? What's the who's this directed to?
Yeah, I mean, the course is accessible to anyone that wants to commit to healing. I do, the more advanced trainings are for folks that want to practice energy medicine in a more professional context, but even lay people can, take that path. But yeah, this is an introductory course that makes energy medicine, somatics and mindfulness, all very practical from the get-go. It's just really giving you a robust set of tools, and that are complementary to other practices or tools or treatments that you may be, going through. So just helping you feel well supported along the way, well equipped.
Yeah, no, I love it. Right. Here's one of the things that I'm just going to call out is like a burst of healers and traumatic healers and all these other people have come onto the scene, especially through COVID, right? But you didn't just get started in this over the past few years. Can you and I bring that up just because I want to make sure that people understand that you're well versed. You don't just teach this like out of a basement to like a bunch of people smoking weed and whatnot. Like you go and you're teaching this to healthcare professionals, right? What's the response been from healthcare professionals?
So I find that healthcare professionals are coming to me for a couple of reasons, either to become more well-versed in trauma-informed care, so they can better support their patients, their clients with trauma. Because, if they don't have tools to work with trauma, then they may feel kind of ill-equipped to really support, their patients or clients the way they would like to. Or the other piece of that is, caregiver fatigue or secondary trauma, where healthcare professionals are taking on their patients' trauma. And they're both related, because if you know how to hold space and support other people in their trauma, you're less likely to take it on. And I think as caregivers, I think the work too, I came to this work 20 years ago, just to heal myself. I was working a whole nother world in the nonprofit world, and this was not my plan. So a lot of people come to this work just to heal themselves. And one of my students last night was like, wow, I can really see myself sharing this with other people in the future. So, but yeah, but it is interesting because I have had some students who've, started a training with me, and before the training has even started, they have the agenda to become the healer. And I always take pause with that, and it's like, nope, that's an agenda. Like, that's an agenda. So if you're in it for that, like you're many steps ahead, right? So I find that most people who are coming in all sincerity to support themselves and to heal themselves usually become the greatest valuable resources to support others in their healing, because they've taken the time, to do the work for themselves.
Right. And they've had the actual, they've gone through it and know what it feels like to go through the process, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's jump in. Yeah. Go ahead. Well, I think there's a beautiful thing about having healing so accessible. But, I've seen it, someone comes back from, South America after having a plant medicine ceremony and, had this like life altering experience. And then now they're here to change everyone else's lives. And it's like, well, you've gotten a glimpse of, let's say, God, if that's your context, or you've gotten a glimpse of consciousness or spirit or oneness, whatever that is for you. but it's like now it takes years and years to like let that become seeped into each and every cell, to become seeped into like a deeper synthesis and understanding of self. And so I think that's an important process that I think many skip.
Look, I mean,
the awakening.
Yeah, some of those experiences, and especially if you're having those for the first time, they're mind blowing, right? You're like, everybody wants to go shout from the top of a mountain, right, about it. But what you're talking about is, kind of the integration piece, right? Embodying that and really let that come in and you become it, right? Versus, after the novelty wears off, right? Like, where are you then? Are you still in it? Is that still how you feel? Is that still true for you? And how have you, integrated that into your life? It's funny, right? Like, for me, it's funny because I just, seeing so much of it now, and 20 years ago, it was, nobody was really talking about it, right? And everybody's like, shh, don't talk about it, right? Or people are gonna give you crazy eye looks, and like, you shouldn't be talking about that. And everybody's out there talking about it now, and I think that's great. But learn more about it, and like you're saying, embody it and become it. Greg, help me out here, right? I'm seeing trauma like everywhere now. Is everything trauma? Can anything be trauma? Is the word being overused? Where are you at with that?
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. I mean, I think as much as there may be so many people who are moving into the healing space after just one awakening before there's integration, that's also part of maybe the process of mainstreaming this work and this consciousness, so it becomes more of the fabric of society. And so, with that, is there can some of that be problematic and troublesome? Sure. And yet I think that's just part of how we have a growing awareness, right? And then I think over time there does need to be a refinement of that awareness and a nuance and a deeper understanding, as opposed to just a buzzword. Because I mean, it's definitely become a buzzword now, and and so I think we need to look at that, and I think it's important to then vet out who we're doing this type of work with, having trusted companions along the way.
Sure. I mean, and to your point, right? Like, I mean, I'd rather everybody, people talk about it than continue to repress it, right, and not express it in some way, right? So that there is an openness around trauma, period, right?
And I think, with, let's say, the Me Too movement, and just a lot of, if we bridge it out into like the political and this larger social, cultural world, we're just seeing a lot more of the woundedness of the world, right? It's hard to not see it, where I think, a few decades ago, that was less the case. It was still kind of, hush, hush, don't talk about that. Put on, your best face, your best Sunday dress. And so I think the gift in that is that when we can see the wound, we can begin to heal it. And so, that's...
What do you think's allowing for that, Greg?
I mean, I can only speak from my own experience. I just think as time evolves, I just think, there have been so many social political movements where, people are finding that they can take up more residence in who they are and own, their lived experience and their identity and the impact that the larger world has had on, the individual. And so, and I think finding a sense of community in that. So I think, I think the lie of trauma is that we can't, and that we're isolated and that we're alone. And I think the truth of healing is that we can, and we're connected, and that's a powerful force. But I think that the more that people have, I think there's been a wave, since the 60s and 70s of like, healing and consciousness, happening. And so I think that's been happening kind of on the periphery. And I think enough of that has happened now that it's creating a consciousness that anything that's not matching that is just bubbling to the surface. And so I just think it's hard to deny, what is at this stage in our evolution, if you will.
Yeah, no, I love it. I was just kind of curious, how you saw that, right? Because I think again we can all see it a little bit differently, and I just appreciate that perception of it, right?
And there's days where I look at the news and it's like, oh my gosh, the world is just coming to an end, and
right,
and yet it's like if I kind of map, one book I have my students read is The 7 Lessons of Chaos. I'm forgetting the 2 names of the authors, but it's like out of tremendous chaos comes new order. So if I look at like every chaotic incident in my own life and in my own healing path, as I gathered more tools and resources and support, those breakdowns turned into breakthroughs, which yielded a whole new organizational intelligence within my body, my mind, and my spirit, a whole new vibrational intelligence, more aligned to like my connection to source, universal energy, whatever that is for each of us. So
do you have do you remember like what one of those scenarios might be, or an example of that?
I mean, for me, I'm just thinking of like just a breakup I went through that, at the time felt earth shattering, but it's like, the life I live now after that, 10 years later is remarkably different and probably wouldn't be possible in that old paradigm I was living. But prior to that, I couldn't have imagined anything different. Right. So sometimes what brings us to our knees is going to bring us to our center and like call upon our highest self. And so that's, I mean, there's been many other iterations of that, micro and macro in my own journey. But, if I'm to then just to map the fact that I no longer live with chronic pain, anxiety, depression, I'm 3 inches taller today than I was 25 years ago.
How about that? That's crazy.
It's like I know that we can mine the gold of unresolved trauma, and there's like so much wisdom and just so much. There's just such a gift that we can glean from the deepest pain. So I'm holding the vision that that's what we're sorting through on a much more collective level today. And I think there are no guarantees from 7 life lessons of chaos, right? Chaos can spit out a new organizational intelligence, or it can make a big mess of things. And I think healing, there are no guarantees in life, right? And so even the thought of healing can feel risky. I was having this conversation with students last night because, we've learned how to survive by often keeping so much suppressed and bottled up inside. And it could feel really life or death if we start to, let some of that out until we realize that we have the resource, the tools, and the capacity to kind of let that wave flow through us and then kind of return back to ourselves. So.
For sure. No, I love that imagery too. What, you said you've got, kind of a referral network where people come through to you. What's like an example of someone who was, not able to get healed, but has had through success through what you offer?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I mean, that one woman that I mentioned, for her, it was a bunch of autoimmune stuff, which was then tied into chronic pain, which was tied into fibromyalgia, which was turned into some neuropathy, which was also tied into insomnia and brain fog, so digestive issues, gut health, so all of this stuff that, she was going to all these different specialists to treat everything as if it's separate. And it's like, actually, why don't we just clear up the trauma that's been creating the residue that's not allowing your life force energy to flow? And as we do that, then, the connective tissue, which was storing all of your trauma, when we clear the trauma, that the connective tissue really is functioning as like an information superhighway. So information can communicate to each and every cell or all the tissues. And so, she's a great example of someone who was at the end of her rope, literally in terms of her health and financially, hadn't been able to get out of bed for 2 years. She's a perfect example. So kind of,
and she's up and running now, right? Is that what you're saying? She was able to clear all that out. She was able to restore, I guess, her bodily network. Is that how you would kind of say it?
Yeah, I like that imagery. Yeah, I think that, again, our emotions, our thoughts, our muscles, our tissues, our cells, the physiology, the anatomy, the consciousness should be a unified field of information that are, completely in constant communication. And the trauma kind of short circuits those communication pathways. So then nothing's functioning in relationship to anything else. And that's a big piece. If you look at it relationally with trauma, there's usually a break where we no longer feel safe in relationship to others. Then we no longer feel safe in relationship to ourselves. So then that starts to get replicated within our bodies, where it's like, our liver and our heart and our liver and our gallbladder should be in communication with one another. They should know what the other is doing at all times and why.
Right.
And, the trauma, it's like these different body parts then start to turn their backs on each other, right? And
right.
Still doing their job, but they've lost an awareness that they're on the same team. So They might start be working in contradiction to one another.
Gotcha. Well, no, it's all awesome, right? And I love it. So, you provide a course where people can learn a lot of this information for themselves and try to apply it for their own well-being. So I think that's fantastic. And my guess is, they can go deeper on this with you as well if they're so inclined. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Greg, I'm at the little spot here that, I look at this podcast as kind of like spiritual speed dating, right? Somebody's going to tune in and they're going to be like, you know what? I've had enough of Brandon and I'm ready to move on, right? And so I got a couple questions I'd like to ask you as you could be somebody's next spiritual speed date.
All right, let's do it.
You good for it? Okay, one sec. What's up, bud? You good?
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's see. Spiritual Bachelor number 1. What does it mean to live in the present moment?
I love the idea of totality, like putting my total energy with what is. And so, being here with you, right? But I also like the idea of choiceless awareness. So like, I'm here with you, but you know what? There's a lot of noise out on the street. So I'm also here with that. So I'm not trying to block that out because that's also part of my experience. So I'm just being here in the totality of my time with you, the noise on the street. And so just, being with a total energy with what is.
Got it. Not trying to push any one thing away, just allowing for it all to be.
Yeah, because if I were to try to push that noise on the street away, which I can't do, but if I were to try to do that, that would imply force, effort, intention, which would really be, the antithesis of kind of a relaxed, alert awareness. And, I think relaxed, alert awareness is what yields presence.
Got it. I like it. Question number 2. How would God, universe, whatever you want to call it, want us to respond to aggression and terrorism?
I think first and foremost, try to get people to a place of safety. So if you're in the moment of an immediate threat, try to get everyone to safety. I think, understanding, I think this is where we look at like the perpetuation of wounds, the intergenerational patterns that hurt people. So, I think we need to take a step back and like kind of understand why this harm is being perpetuated and kind of, not get caught in cycles of perpetrator and victim and, like stepping back from all of that. Cause I think in some respect, we all play our part in those roles based on just the messiness of our own lived experience.
Sure.
And if we can take a step back from that, there's a little more space for understanding.
Got it. No, I appreciate it. Greg, who would you say is like kind of like your ideal client? Like, who should be reaching out to you?
I mean, in my heart of hearts, I'm just here to help anyone that's in pain. Anyone that, what that mostly looks like is anxiety, depression, chronic pain. I can help people with autoimmune stuff, but anxiety, depression, chronic pain are my main wheelhouse. With that said, I do work with a lot of leaders. I'm really committed to, helping leaders not lead from a trauma response and perpetuate more cycles of harm. So
sure.
I look at, an opportunity that as leaders, we can become vessels of healing. So that there's something about that intersection of leadership and healing that really speaks to me to kind of create kind of a new evolutionary leader that's leading from heart, leading from courage, leading from consciousness, a place of deeper consciousness.
Awesome. No, thank you for that. Where should we send people to connect with you?
Prismamethod.com is where folks can jump right into the course. Greg Wieting, which is WIETING.com. People can find my one-on-one work and access to the course. I'm also on Instagram, Greg_Wieting. So, yeah.
Greg, thanks for being on here with us today. Really appreciate you coming on, and definitely appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Brandon. My pleasure.